Welcome back to the show. Let us say a very good morning to Peter Hitchens. Peter, very nice to have you on again. Happy Bank Holiday Monday.
Well, the same to you.
Now,
I have to say, bank holiday seems even more than usually pointless on a day.
Well,
like
it really does. Although I do notice that in London, certainly, it gets quieter. So all of those people who have returned to work still take the bank holiday off, which I don't quite understand. It's very odd.
One of the reasons they returned to work was so they could take the bank holiday off. Yes.
Exactly right. Now, I've got one question to ask you about this whole ridiculous pantomime of a weekend. When exactly did politics in this country completely lose the plot?
Oh, it's been going on for a long time, but it was basically when the two parties ceased to have any serious differences between each other. I remember when I was a political reporter, this business beginning of the hounding of individual ministers over supposed scandals, which would often begin with the Prime Minister all rallying round and saying he stood by them, and then there would be pictures of them with their families, and then they would resign. These events were quite fun to be involved in, but when I stopped to think about them, I came to the conclusion that what was actually happening was futile, in that nothing actually changed. The media got a scalp. The public had the fun of watching somebody embarrassed and then falling from office. But the policies of the government, and often this involved the Home Office and policies on, say, big issues like crime and immigration, the policies didn't actually change as a result. And so I moved from thinking it was futile to thinking it was worse than futile, was actually positively damaging. Yeah. But it's a substitute for real politics. It's a substitute for the days when you had an opposition which had a different idea about how the country should be run from the government, and which pursued that and which sought to win a general election and change the way the country was run. Now, whoever gets in at any election, the country is running more or less the same way. And these events are really just festivals of the oppressed, during which the people are thrown a hunk of bleeding meat, which they then gather around and pull to pieces. And at the end of it, nothing's changed. Power is still utterly unaltered and hasn't changed any of its policies. And but it was basically during that period, really beginning in the 1980s, of increasingly rapid cultural revolution, during which the two major parties became identical. Yes. I wrote a book about this called the Cameron Delusion, in which I try to explain. It's actually one of the most important books I ever wrote. It tries to explain why politics is now so very odd, and also it explains the extraordinary process known as lunch, by which so much material gets into the newspapers from the government. Yeah,
it's interesting because I wonder as well whether it's the kind of the professionalisation, if you like, of politics, where people are now just professional politicians, and the media only seems to understand politics now by stories like what's been going on this weekend. When people start calling for someone to resign because they've apparently done something wrong, that seems to be the only thing that galvanises the media.
Well,
and I'm so disappointed.
People who've sat on their hands for months over what must be, in my view, the stupidest policy ever adopted by any government in the history of mankind, and said nothing, suddenly get exercised because Dominic Cummings and his wife did what actually is a perfectly reasonable thing, to look after their child during a time when they were both ill. I mean, I first met Dominic Cummings back in the era of Ian Duncan Smith being leader of the Tory party, which must be sometime in the
That was a dark day for them, wasn't it?
I can't remember how long ago it was, and it was dislike at first sight.
Right.
I've never liked him.
What is it about him?
Because I've never found any reason to like him since, and so I'm not his spokesman. And I think anybody listening to this program must know by now that I'm not the spokesman for the government.
No, of course.
But I won't join in this because it just seems to me that it's futile. In that the real problem is the policy. The actual policy of preventing people from leading normal lives, which the government adopted. And the other thing is, I'm very, very ill-disposed towards a system under which people can denounce to the police their fellow citizens for actions which are not illegal. And then the police are banging on their doors and all that. I just think that a society in which people become informers and congratulate themselves and are not ashamed of being informers. They go happily in public and say, I saw him doing this, that, and the other. A society in which being a narc is considered to be okay is a society already halfway down the slope.
Yes, it really is. I mean, I put out a sort of a vaguely humorous tweet yesterday saying I'm about to pop out to the shops. If anybody wants to let the Mirror and the Guardian know where I'm going to be so that they can continue to keep their data protection files up to date, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah,
but it does seem like that.
Sure, you didn't buy anything frivolous as well.
Yes, well, actually, I must confess.
Unless you bought some potatoes along with your bottle of wine.
I must confess, I did buy a Malbec which was on sale, which could be considered frivolous given the seriousness with which we all take.
Well, I'm going to have to stop you in now.
But I mean, it seems extraordinary to me that you know, with everything that's going on. I mean, I did laugh with Grant Shapps when he was amazed that nobody wanted to talk about the A66, and I'd rather ask him about Dominic Cummings, because the government's performance through this, until Boris appeared yesterday, and this is where you and I will probably differ. I thought Boris did the right thing yesterday. He turned up at 5 o'clock. He basically told the press to get lost and said he's staying. Let's move on. But of course, they won't move on, will they?
Well, I don't think they will, no, because it's a gift that goes on giving. There will be more, and it seems to me we still haven't had the whole story, and these things feed on themselves. And also, it's more interesting than going over and over and over again, a subject which has been discussed pretty much without limit now for several months. It's a diversion from that, and obviously the personal alleged wrongdoings of one not particularly attractive human being, and the chance, say, at the end of it, of collecting a scalp, will keep it going. And unless the government can throw something very new into the arena fairly soon, it could keep going long beyond, I think, the old Alistair Campbell rule, which is if something is still going on after 4 days, you've got a problem.
Yes.
If you can't bore them out into something else by then you may actually have to do something. Of course, the New Labour did chuck people to the wolves. Poor old Robin Cook was told, no, choose your wife or your job. David Blunkett was fired. Peter Mandelson was fired. I think they mostly came back to office sooner or later, but they would ultimately chuck people off the sledge. Yeah. If they thought it would suit them, because that's now the process.
But the problem for Boris is that if he allows them to get Cummings, as it were, his entire edifice crumbles, because it's the beginning of the end, isn't it?
I don't think so. I think that people are generally satisfied with these gollets of meat and then go away. That's the sad thing about it for me. What I want is for people to say, isn't it absurd that a senior official in the government is being driven from his job for failing to follow rules which, on any serious account, are ridiculous, and which it increasingly appears did no good at all. And to return to the whole basis of all our discussions, and there's a story in the Times today saying that the people trying to create a vaccine for COVID-19 are having trouble because there aren't enough cases of it now. Right. That it actually the disease is actually disappearing, so it's getting harder and harder to make the necessary tests. Right. And it is, and it's going through what a number of people have said from the start is a normal bell curve of rising, reaching a peak and falling. And I don't think any of the actions which the government took made any substantive difference to that. And
I think you may well be
spasm of banning people from seeing close relatives and stopping them from working and shutting down the economy turns out to have been totally futile. Now, and that's an important story. That's something for which people should resign. But I'm afraid this concentration on the alleged wrongdoings of Dominic Cummings it completely diverts people from a much larger issue.
Yes, although I suppose the side issue...
I think he should stay, but he should be exhibited, perhaps with a face mask on, at every subsequent press conference, like a kind of ghost at the feast, to remind people of the ludicrousness of government policy. Keep him.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's the other thing.
Don't get rid of him. And the other thing people don't seem to grasp is if they're trying to do down Dominic Cummings, I would think that within 6 months of him being driven from this job, he'll pop up again, probably in the private sector, in a much better paid job than he has now. So if they think they're doing him any harm, they're very much mistaken.
Yeah, but this is the trouble. It's a sort of hysteria that starts and doesn't end until somebody gets their pound of flesh, as you say, until the raw meat is sort of thrown to the dogs, because they see Dominic Cummings as the enemy. They see him as the man they must get. They must take him down because he's so arrogant.
There's one part of this. When people say, look, I wasn't... There's one particular person who said, well, I wasn't able to see my dying father in his last hours. And why did I go through all this if Dominic Cummings can behave like this? This is a very reasonable question to ask.
Yeah. No, it absolutely is.
It absolutely is. No reason for it. all the sacrifices which people made because they were corralled and panicked into it by the government now do indeed look extremely. But the response to that isn't punish Dominic Cummings. The response to that is, why was this policy implemented? Why can it not now?
But is there not now, Peter?
Very quickly do something about calling to account the people who got us into this mess.
Yes, but is there not now, Peter, good reason for most people in this country who have suffered like that, who have said that they've sacrificed their loved ones, they've sacrificed seeing people, and I was one of them, by the way. I don't hold any rancour towards Dominic Cummings as a result of that. It was my decision. I suppose if I'd wanted to, I could have broken the lockdown rules, but I didn't.
But you can see why somebody could feel rancour.
Oh, absolutely. I think
we have to sympathise.
Yes, of course, absolutely. And what I'm saying is that more and more you now see people saying things like, well, why should I now honour the lockdown? So it could well be that as a result of all of this, and I'm assuming this is probably happening today, even as we speak, on the beaches of this country, in the Lake District, in the Peak District, in various sunspots around Britain, there will be loads and loads of people out and about, and if a police officer comes up to them and tries to say anything, they'll say, well, what about Dominic Cummings?
Why don't you go, why are you wasting your time on me?
Right.
I'm sure that will happen. And I think the police will be well aware of it in all that they do.
And did you not also?
But the thing is, this is not the way it should end.
Right. But I thought of you last week, Peter.
A breakdown of confidence in government and authority, which is never a good thing in the long term. It should end with an admission by the government that what they did was a mistake.
Yeah.
And unless that happens, we are condemned for years of the face mask fanatics and the people drawing chalk lines on the floor and not letting us do this and schools and every industry you care to think of crippled by ridiculous restrictions. There has to be an admission this was all a stupid mistake, and it seems to me that the behaviour both of Mr. Cummings and of Professor Ferguson suggests that the people at the very heart of this never really took it as seriously as they wanted.
Well, I would differ from you on that one, because I think certainly in Ferguson's case, yes, but not in Cummings' case, because Cummings' reasoning for doing what he did, and you may or may not believe what he says, but his reasoning for doing what he did was not in complete and utter ignorance of the law, or indeed in a deliberate attempt to get around the law. He believed that he was acting within the law, which is what he has said, and it would appear that that is the case. But what I found interesting last week, and this is when I thought of you, was when I saw the story from the CPS, who have basically said to the police that all the people who have been given tickets and fines for supposedly disobeying the lockdown rules they're throwing all the tickets away because they don't know what law they've actually broken.
Well, I think this is a very interesting point, and from the start, again, Jonathan Sumption was casting doubt on whether there was ever a serious legal basis. I remember in the initial few days of the shutdown, I spent some time pursuing officials in the government to try and find out what the legal basis of it actually was. Right. And the impression I got was that they were searching for one, and hadn't really found anything terribly satisfactory. Eventually they hit on the Public Health Act of 1984 as a basis for it. But I still think that if ever this does actually come to court, they might be in quite serious trouble over it. And in any case, under the Bill of Rights of 1689, which as far as I know is still in force, the fining of people without due process is straightforwardly against the law anyway. So the whole thing has been a colossal bluff. Now, if it had been worthwhile, and if there had been a good point to it, then there would be some sense to that.
Yes.
I draw to your attention something which I've tweeted. I'm hoping to blow in it later on. It's a fascinating article in some website called the American Institute for Economic Research, giving the origins of the whole idea of shutdown. And it's called the 2006 Origins of the Lockdown Idea. Right. And you'll be amazed to discover where these ideas came from, where the phrase social distancing originated. And also about the considerable arguments which took place inside government, with a lot of scientists saying, some years ago, this is a very foolish response to this, and it won't work. Yeah, well, I certainly said earlier last week, after you and I had spoken, that I blame we do these little tricks here at Talk Radio. Dan Wootton had me on as, if you were Prime Minister for 5 minutes, what would you do? How would you do it differently? And I said, well, I would start quizzing the scientists a bit more, because we keep being told we're following the science, but the science has changed dramatically from the beginning to where we are now. And I don't blame the government for going into lockdown when they did, because as you and I differ
put on. I think it was important at the time that the NHS wasn't overrun. I know you don't think that was a good enough reason, but I think it was. However, now that we are where we are, it's clearly time to give all that up and to start opening the economy again. And they're trying to do it, and yet they get the unions saying, "Oh, but it's too dangerous to go back to school," even as they're getting in their cars to go to the beach.
Well, yes, it's true, but again, I mean, my point about the NHS is that there was no danger to the NHS.
Yeah, but we thought there might be, so they had to take a precaution.
That, as it happened, the overwhelming never took place, and there is not a scrap of evidence that the government's actions made any difference to that. So until they produce it, I'm going to carry on saying what is true. That the government's intervention was pointless and achieved nothing, and indeed reverse achieved things because of the huge number of people who've now been diverted from treatment of quite dangerous conditions, because the NHS has pretty much shut down everything but its COVID operation.
Well, the other question, of course...
Not to mention the huge absurdity, which I think there should honestly be more fuss about, of the complete shutdown of dental care in this country, which is causing a lot of people a great deal of pain and discomfort and worry for no reason that I can see. The government has the burden of proof on it to show that what it did had a point to it. And that's what we really, and I think that there were probably quite a few people in government who had serious doubts about this, and I think these are reflected in the fact that of what Dominic Cummings did. Whether it was legal or not, it certainly doesn't seem to me to fit very much with the spirit of what they were telling the rest of us to do.
No, I think that's very clear. But I mean, as I say, I mean, you and I, the only thing we pretty much differ on really is the shutdown initially had to happen.
Well, it's quite an important difference.
Well, it is a very important difference. But I believe that what they knew at the time that they knew it, having been advised by the scientists that this could happen if they didn't shut down, they couldn't take that chance. In the same way that they will now not apologise for it, because no politician can afford to make it look as if they did something wrong. I mean, you say very often, you know, people like you and I sometimes get things wrong, and we sometimes have to then apologise for that. Politicians don't apologise. Boris Johnson would look like an idiot if he said this was all a mistake and we should never have done it, and he won't be able to say that.
I disagree. I think the public would be overwhelmed with joy if a politician was ever honest enough to apologise for a mistake.
Look at what they're saying. No, but look at what they're saying now.
The attitude towards politicians, and so that person in particular, if anybody were ever to turn around and say, "Look, I'm terribly sorry, I've really did err on this," I think it would be a revolutionary moment.
It would be a revolutionary moment, but it would be the end of their careers. Because just one second, let me just say this.
You mentioned the science again. There is differing science, and you probably saw the fascinating interview which Sunetra Gupta, the noted Oxford epidemiologist, gave to the Unheard website last week. And here is a complete alternative set of opinions on how to handle this thing, which was available to the government at the time, which they didn't take.
Right.
And this whole business of talking about the science, of putting the definite article in front of it, the thing about science, about serious science, is it is actually about disagreement and questioning. That's how science progresses. And the idea that the one position that you have to follow is actually a demonstration of ignorance of science, not an honouring of science as a proper influence. The scientific method is a fantastic step forward in human history, that people are saying we need to actually pursue the truth at all costs, which is basically what science is. Yeah. But to imagine that means the sort of worship as if they were a priesthood of particular scientists without thinking about the subject is a complete mistake.
Yes, I agree with that totally, but that's what I'm saying. And yet we have had to take the view of the particular scientists that the government have chosen to advise them, and they had really no choice but to take that advice, having said that they were going to.
But
hang on, let me just finish the point. The point is that you say that it would be a revolutionary moment if the Prime Minister admitted he'd made a mistake. Look at how people are behaving already, who say because of what Dominic Cummings did, they now feel bitter about the fact that they couldn't go to their loved ones' funerals, that they couldn't see their elderly parents before they died, that they couldn't look in on their girlfriend or boyfriend. Imagine what those people would say if he came out and said, "Oh, it was all a mistake."
Well, I think they might. They might well say, "Well, I'm very glad you've admitted that."
I think so.
It would be a much better way of dispelling that bitterness, since these events have happened. It would be a much better way of dispelling this business to say, "Look, I'm sorry, I made a terrible mistake, and I deeply regret it." And if the government were to resign, which is what would really be a great step forward, then if as I say, the worst mistake made in modern history, then either to throw an unelected aide off the sledge to save their skins, or to simply continue to insist that no one's done anything wrong. I honestly think that contrition by people who've made mistakes is valued by people. Genuine contrition, a genuine willingness to apologize and seek forgiveness is the basis of civilized relations.
That may well be,
but
timing is also everything.
The basis of justice is people admitting that they've done something wrong.
Yes, I get that, but the point is, when you admit it is important as well, because there's no point admitting it when we haven't come out of it. When, however, the economy starts to recover, when we start to unlock things, when people's kids start going back to schools, when you can go back to the pub and have a pint of Harvey's Ale down in Sussex with me at some point, then we can say, actually, you know what, we might have gone a bit far, because people will be enjoying themselves again. But while we're still sitting here wondering when the hell we'll be able to ever go on holiday again, I don't think this is the time.
Yeah. Well, actually, I say the sooner the better, and therefore, because I can hear from where I'm standing, I can hear the economy gurgling away down the drain. And
I think it's coming back a bit, don't you?
It gurgles, and I say do it now, and let's have the admission. And I also say do it now because if we don't do it now, then it will happen again. And I also say do it now because if we don't do it now, then all kinds of futile and stupid restrictions on civilized life will continue into the foreseeable future. And I just had to say one thing again: there was a choice right at the beginning of this. Sunetra Gupta's research and advice and the different modelling were available to the government. They chose to take different advice. It was their responsibility.
Sure.
And they can't hide behind the science. The fact
I don't think they are hiding behind it.
They had a responsibility. They had the power to choose. They had sought. The people in the cabinet sought all their lives, had fought, had spent enormous amounts of effort, and I would expect money, to reach the post which they attained. They had that responsibility. They wanted it. They were given it. They messed it up.
Well, let me leave you with one thought, which we could discuss next week. I read a thing the other day, which was fascinating, and there's not going to be enough time for you to come back on it, so I'm just going to leave you with it. The first wave of this coronavirus was actually in November and December. What we had in April was the second wave, which means we won't get a second wave because we've already had it. I'll leave you with that thought, Peter. Thank you very much indeed. Peter Hitchens talking to us for the 8th week in a row. He'll be back next week for the 9th week. There will be in double digits. It will be quite extraordinary. But what do you make of that? Could we have had the second wave already? This is Talk Radio.